Hello and thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Sheen from Stratfor's editorial team, and with me today is our Vice President of Intelligence, Fred Burton, and we'll be talking about the role of females in jihadist and militant activity. Now, Fred, in the wake of the San Bernardino shootings, a lot of media attention was placed on the fact that it was a husband and wife team, and that one of the shooters was in fact a female. What are your thoughts on the perception that women can't be terrorists or don't commit violent acts?
Well, I've seen that my entire career. We've seen husband-wife teams going back for a long period of time, Ben. You can look at organizations like the Japanese Red Army was founded and led by a female, and there's a long history of female assassins and terrorists and husband and wife teams.
And I suppose it makes sense because actually, if people aren't suspecting a female, then they can slip under the radar.
I think so. I think when you look at this in context, though, there's profiling that comes into play that we've all experienced in the course of our career, whether it's in the military or in law enforcement or as a federal agent. I think we're all on point expecting that male to come charging with a gun, but very few of us think of this in context of, well, could that female also be an assassin? And I think that what we're trying to do with our piece that we have written is explain that there is a history of husband and wife teams. This is not a new phenomena. Terrorism is very old, so this should not be surprising, but yet it is.
And it's interesting that there's not only the overt role that women can play in acts of terrorism, and we've seen it in Sri Lanka, Chechnya, Europe, Africa, all over, but also it's the role almost behind the scenes. And I was interested to find out that an individual who clearly you know well, and I used to think of as somebody who operated in his own, and of course we're talking about Carlos the Jackal, that there was a big influence in his life that actually influenced his activity.
Carlos was that kind of pivotal figure that the world was enamored with as the first global assassin. Before bin Laden, you had Carlos the Jackal, and yet his sidekick was his wife, Magdalena Kopp, who was a German, who I actually had corresponded with before she passed away in June on one of my old cases. And one of my prized possessions in my office is a autographed copy of my book, Chasing Shadows, which Carlos the Jackal actually signed.
And it's interesting because when you do have these charismatic figures, they often don't work independently. They have a movement and a following. And we see this to some extent with the Islamic State. Because the movement has a degree of attraction for a certain type of individual, people are going to join that, including, as we've seen, young females who wish to join the fight, though it doesn't always end out well for them, does it?
No, well, like in most terrorism cases, it typically doesn't. Usually individuals end up either being terminated on the battlefield or captured in some capacity. But I think when you look at this and from a practical aspect, it's logical when you start thinking of this from even going back to the Bonnie and Clyde days. But I think there's something that captivates the media and people in general when you have these husband and wife teams, because there's a normalcy factor in all of our lives, and then all of a sudden you have a husband and wife team. And in this case, in San Bernardino, where the husband goes into the workplace and kills people that he actually knew, supported by his wife. So it's such an over-the-top kind of event that it's hard to even wrap your head around how these kinds of things unfold.
Very much so. And it's certainly you probably experienced this in your career, Fred, the whole idea of sleeper cells. And actually, you're much less likely to suspect a couple than you are potentially even a single female or a single male, because a couple, for some reason, you assume aren't a threat when they're together.
And I think you can look back intelligence services. For example, the Russian KGB have learned that over the years with the husband and wife team concept as well. And there's a benefit of hiding in plain sight with that degree of normalcy that you'll see with that husband and wife team. And yet when you do see something like San Bernardino, or even go back to the days of the Jackal, there's this shocking aspect to it that just captivates everybody's attention.
And of course, there's the famous cases like Patty Hearst, who was effectively radicalized, and she became the figurehead for her movement.
Absolutely, with the Sudanese Liberation Army. And then you have Squeaky Fromm and Sarah Jane Moore that tried to assassinate former President Ford.
So clearly this is a trend that, rather than being anything new, it's the continuation of something we've seen for decades, potentially centuries.
Absolutely, and we've written about this a lot here at Stratfor, that terrorism is not a new phenomena, and this, in essence, is just the norm.
Well, Fred, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today.
Thanks.
For more on this subject and many more, please continue to read stratfor.com.